twofold. The first half of this webinar will really be focused on presenting some data that we have around our local economy, our state economy, and our national economy. And we're going to try and zoom through this data. We've got about 5 to 7 minute target for each of these 3 buckets, really just to present a picture of the current state of our economy, with the caveat that a lot of this data is from Q1 or March month end, and we know that April may be an even grimmer picture. So we try and present some estimates where we can, but that's really just to give a glimpse. The real important part of this webinar is the second half, where we have a conversation around recovery and what that may look like. In terms of our panelists, as I mentioned, we've got a great set of panelists with us today. We've got Nancy Bird, who's the Executive Director of the Iowa City Downtown District, Kate Moreland, who's the President of the Iowa City Area Development Group, and Josh Schomburger, who's the President of Think Iowa City. They are my peers in this joint effort, and I'm really excited to have them on the panel. They'll help kind of speak to the local perspective. We also have Joe Murphy, who's the Executive Director of the Iowa Business Council, and he's going to tell you a little bit more about that council in a moment here, and also share out what he's seeing at the state level. And then lastly, we have David Barker, who's a member of the Iowa Board of Regents and a partner in Barker Companies, and he's also a former economist with the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. David's going to share out some national level data, but he also wears several hats here. He can speak to local economy as a local business owner, and also to state, as well as with his participation on the Iowa Board of Regents. So I'm going to cover here, and I'm going to set my timer so I can try and stay on time, but I'm going to zoom through some of this local data we have here, starting with our unemployment data. So we have, as of this 5-week period between March 15th and April 18th, around 11,000 unemployment insurance claims in Johnson County were submitted. And just to put that into context, week of March 1st, there were 55 claims. And then it jumped to the peak was the week of March 29th with a little over 3,000 claims. And so jumping to 11,000, it's a lot. In terms of the largest segments that have been impacted, that's healthcare and social services, accommodation and food service, retail, education services, and in terms of our March unemployment rate, we're at 2.6%, where we were at 1.9 for February. The U.S. unemployment rate for March of 2020 is 4.4, so we're doing a little bit better than national. Want to share out some data where we have it around some of our industries, starting with hotels. And this data was provided by Think Iowa City. And again, like these are some of their estimates for April. These numbers haven't been confirmed. They'll get confirmed in May, but they wanted to give everyone insight into what things are looking like in the hotel world. In terms of the estimate around occupancy rates, they think that's at 15 to 20%, whereas last April at this time it was at 60%. The estimated average daily rates are around 75%. That's 20% below normal. And the estimated revenue per available room is around $15, which is 70% below normal. The estimated that 80 to 90% of local hotel industry employees at the property level have been laid off. There are 4 local hotels that are completely closed, and many are being operated right now by senior management who are working the front desk, cleaning, doing laundry, all of that. So that's a pretty grim picture of our hotel industry. And unfortunately, equally so for our restaurant industry. We don't have local data, but the Iowa Restaurant Association recently did a study of around 650 hospitality operators from across the state the week of April 13th. And here's some of the data that they recently released. 95% of restaurant operators report total dollar sales volume down for this time last year. There's about 75% decline in sales on average. 92% of bar operators are completely closed, with an 89% decline in bar sales. They anticipate the industry will lose more than $310 million in sales in April alone. 87% of restaurants and bars have laid off, furloughed, or terminated employees in the past 30 days. 45% project being able to rehire all of their employees that they released. And 58% of the venues are offering food via carry-out, drive-through, and delivery. However, for most, that is not a profitable option. Also want to make note that while we don't have local data around some of these other small businesses, they are also being significantly impacted, and that includes retail, includes arts and entertainment, and sports and rec, our gyms, personal care services. You think of the businesses like salons and spas that really can't offer a service online or do pickup or delivery, and those are heavily being impacted. Our health services like chiropractors, professional services, or independent consultants, nonprofits, and the list goes on and on. And so there's a lot of other businesses we know that are experiencing similar impacts. And equally so, large employers also experiencing that impact. In the news the past couple of weeks, you've seen some numbers reported from the University of Iowa Healthcare, reported surgeries down 75%. That's contributing to an estimated 45 to 50 million in COVID-19 related losses per month. City of Iowa City also reported on their fiscal year 2020 Q3, which was January to March. Parking fund collected about 8% less in revenue, which translates to a loss of nearly 2 million. And they expect that impact is going to be much greater in Q4 as we move through the year, and especially long term as you look at potential decline in property tax revenue. And then you're also again seeing in the news several large private employers report furloughs and pay cuts and salary freezes and all of that. So large industry feeling that as well. Some possible bright spots, or I don't want to say necessarily bright spots, it's kind of relatively speaking, but got some data from our greater Iowa City Area Home Builders Association in terms of how construction permits in particular are doing. And when you look at those numbers, Q1 of 2019 compared to Q1 of 2020, you see that construction permits for single family dwellings, multifamily permit units, total residential models has gone up. So this past Q1 has been good for them, but the challenge will be to continue to build affordable homes, and there is a market need for that. There is probably the residential permits are being hardest hit as homeowners are cautious as to who enters their homes. But the Home Builders Association does, is looking at the impact for potentially for Q2 and Q3 and navigating that, but are predicting that Q4 will be strong. Same with in terms of the housing sector. Got some data from the Iowa City Area Association of Realtors, and you look at their data set for March, and it looks pretty good in terms of the average sale price of homes going up, average days on market, went down, totally monthly sales went up. But again, and then they're estimating that April numbers will also look strong. But again, like as you look further down, in this year, we may not see the full impact of COVID-19 on the housing industry until the summer months. And then lastly, I just want to point out the Iowa Economic Development Authority did do a survey in March, the second half of March, by businesses across the state. There were almost 14,000 Iowa businesses that responded, which is great, and 621 of them in Johnson County. Got some data around what are business thinking in terms of the economic impact on revenue. Currently, 30 days out, 60 days out, and you see that most reported, 50, close to 60% impact. Now, this was back in March, and so a lot changes month to month. So they are going to be conducting a second survey in early May, and I hope that everyone does respond to that, because that survey gives them data to inform action. And so I'm going to end. I feel like that was around the world and the local economy in 60 seconds here, but I'm going to pass the buck now to Joe to cover the state perspective.
Great. Well, thank you, Kim, and thanks to everybody joining today. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all today, and just want to convey my thanks and appreciation for all that you are all doing in the Iowa City area, and certainly throughout the entire state as well. It's a huge impact. You guys have done a lot already, and will continue to do more. So, Kim, if we could advance a couple of slides. Great. So just to kind of frame the conversation, I wanted to share just a little bit about the Iowa Business Council. We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization. We're comprised of the 22 top executives of some of Iowa's largest employers. And we were established in 1985. And I think that's a very important founding date for us. As you all know or recall, in the 1980s, Iowa was in the midst of a horrific farm crisis, and business leaders at that time came together and decided that they needed to do something collectively to bring the level of economic prosperity throughout the entire state of Iowa, coming together as executives and using business as a method or a tool to provide for that prosperity. And so our mission is to serve as a catalyst for economic growth throughout the entire state. And our core functions as an organization are wrapped up in global thought leadership, research, and then overall advocacy. And you can really almost think of us as a mini think tank. Next slide, please, Kim. So when you think about the Iowa Business Council, again, we have some of the largest companies in the state of Iowa. In 2019, we had more than 163,000 Iowans employed. We had more than $7.5 billion in payroll. You can see the statistics on down the line. And so the point of this slide is to really just sort of emphasize the totality of Iowa's economy, particularly within our members. And then also to remind folks that business, particularly larger businesses in the state of Iowa, play such an important role in the overall health and well-being and economic growth of the entire state. And our members really span the entire spectrum of companies, whether they're manufacturers, whether they're financial institutions or reside in a rural or urban area. We span the entire state. Next slide, please. One of the things that we do at the Iowa Business Council is comprise an economic outlook survey. And it just so happened that we do this every single quarter, and our data went out to our top executives in the middle of March, literally right before this pandemic hit Iowa. Our quarter one survey for 2020 clocked in at 37.5. And to put that into perspective, anything less than 50 is considered a negative outlook. At the end of 2019, the fourth quarter of 2019, we were at just above 60 for a total score. So we've dropped considerably since then. And this is the worst posting for our score since 2009 in the midst of the Great Recession. Concerns obviously look at uncertainty. Concerns also with respect to a patchwork system throughout the entire country. We're beginning to see states, including our own, begin to reopen. What does that mean for our companies? Not only does it have an impact locally, but it has an impact globally as well. So many of our member companies and so many Iowa companies do business outside of the state. And so as these states start to reopen, there's really not a consistent pattern. Part of that's being dictated by public health metrics, which is important, and we certainly appreciate that, but it just makes the overall situation a little bit more difficult to navigate in. And so I think the overall question is this a U curve, a V curve, or is this a W curve with respect to recovery? Is it a U curve, meaning it's more pronounced or more slow? Is it a V curve where we go down quickly into a trough and then quickly come back up? I think a lot of people had optimistically hoped that would be our case. I don't necessarily think that now. Or is it going to be something like a W where we go down and then come back up? And then if there's a second wave in the fall, do we go back down again and then quickly come up? Again, it just feeds the overall uncertainty of the state perspective. And so there's a lot going on, right? I mean, we have more and more cases every single day. Businesses need certainty to make decisions, to make capital investments and make investments based on their workforce needs. And there's just not a lot of that right now, which is unsettling. Next slide, please. So if you look at our overall history from our economic quarterly survey, you can see here the totality of that range. You can see on the left-hand side on your screen the precipitous drop-off at the start of the Great Recession and then a gradual pickup over the next few quarters. And then you can see the cliff effect that we just sort of encountered over the last quarter as well. And so we'll see how things look out moving forward. We'll survey our members, our CEOs, here at the end of June and see what they say. I think the longer that this goes on, the longer the uncertainty is the more difficult it will be for organizations, firms, and businesses to come back up out of this. Next slide, please. And so while we're relatively pessimistic at the moment, one thing is for certain, and I really appreciate the first slide, and that we're all in this together, because we really are, and we will get through this. You know, we've had very dire situations before as a state, as I mentioned with the farm crisis in 1985. We've weathered, particularly on your side of the state, 2 500-year floods within a 12-year time frame. We're a resilient state, and so are our companies. Certainly our people are, and we will absolutely get through this. Another note of optimism, I think, is that this is really nothing like 2008, 2009 from a recession standpoint. This is a natural disaster, effectively. The fundamentals of the economy in most sectors were very strong moving into this situation that we now find ourselves in. And I think additionally on that, and David can speak to this certainly better than I can, the amount of liquidity that's now in the economy, whether it's on firms or businesses' balance sheets, is much stronger than it was in 2008, 2009. The Fed and the Congress and states have acted extremely quickly with respect to national programs and state programs to get money into the hands of small businesses and entrepreneurs. Certainly there needs to be more done, but the fact that we're able to have that transfer occur so quickly is very important. And so we're optimistic looking forward. We know it's going to be a long slog, but Iowans are tough, and we'll get through this. Next slide. So I look forward to the questions. This is my contact information. Please feel free to reach out, you know, before, during, or after the presentation, and would be glad to connect. Thank you, Kim.
Great, thank you, Joe, for that overview there. We're gonna now lastly shift to the national perspective. So David, you're up. Oops, we gotta unmute you, David.
There we go. Now I'm unmuted. All right, so 2 slides up. Let's go. And first, I just want to express, you know, best wishes and sympathy to everyone, however you're affected by this situation. So just a summary of what I'll talk about. First of all, there's been unprecedented damage to the Main Street economy in the U.S. We've never seen anything like it. We have bad but not unprecedented declines in financial markets. This has resulted in a gigantic government response, lots of spending, lots of borrowing, but we have no signs of inflation. In fact, just the opposite. And I'll talk about that some more. And then finally, I'll talk about some competing economic theories that we may be hearing more about how to deal with this. So next slide. So here's an example of just how unprecedented this is. This is going back 50 years of unemployment claims. And I say I tried to find as much, you know, daily or weekly data as I could, because of course, you know, quarterly data just really doesn't do much for us in this situation. I've heard the same thing from businesses that are used to getting monthly reports. They are pushing their people and their accounting staff. We need daily reports in this situation. But there's no statistical distribution you can imagine of unemployment claims that would allow you to think that such a result as you see in the far right-hand corner, or far right, is even possible, right? We see ups and downs through the business cycle of unemployment claims, and then in a matter of, you know, a few weeks, we see this gigantic spike like we have never seen before. Next slide. Another example that I kind of like, this is an economic policy uncertainty index. This is going back 120 years. And it measures uncertainty by looking at the use of certain words in newspapers. All right, so going all the way back to that time. And you can see ups and downs through the Great Depression, through other times. But what's going on now, absolutely unprecedented. The kind of uncertainty about the economic situation, about economic policy, we've never seen anything like it in the modern era. I mean, just off the charts, all right? So next slide. Another example of things that are absolutely unprecedented. Oil prices were chugging along at about $60 a barrel. Then when the COVID hits China, you can see, and their demand starts going down, you can see oil prices starting to come down. Then as it hits Europe and then the United States, it plummets until we got to a point last week where you literally could not give it away. Oil prices were negative. Right, next slide. This shows real GDP, gross domestic product, and the percentage change by quarter. And this is going back to 1947, which is as far back as we have quarterly data. And you can see in bad times, right, GDP goes down by, in the worst times around 2%, 2.5%. All right. Well, the Congressional Budget Office forecast is for GDP to be down 12% in the second quarter. 12% in a single quarter. And again, it's easy to get confused by whether these numbers are annualized or just for a quarter. These numbers are just per quarter. Then you multiply them by 4 to get the annualized number. All right. So we're down, we're going to be down, well, with declines, you don't multiply by 4. That's a mathematical oddity to watch out for. But real GDP is supposed to be down. They're expecting 12% in the second quarter. Nothing has ever happened like that before. Not even if you go back further to the Great Depression have we seen a quarterly decline like that. Now, we don't have good quarterly information from that time. The estimates suggest even then we didn't have that kind of decline. All right. Expecting the Congressional Budget Office is also forecasting the unemployment rate to get to 16%. Unbelievable numbers. All right, next slide. Now, so the government response that I mentioned, right? This is the total assets. Looking at the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve. All right. So before the financial crisis, that was a pretty stable thing, the Federal Reserve balance sheet. Then, in reaction to the financial crisis, that balance sheet ballooned. The Federal Reserve bought an enormous amount of assets, and then that increased further with with rounds of quantitative easing. Then over time, we eventually got to a point where the Federal Reserve was trying to reduce that, reverse their positions, and started selling off assets. Then there was some indication of economic weakening, a lot of pressure from the president also, and that started to reverse late last year and early this year. But then when the pandemic hits, incredible buying binge by the Federal Reserve, flooding the system with liquidity, buying up a tremendous amount of assets. Next slide. All right, and government debt. Also, this is showing gross federal debt as a percentage of GDP. That spike off to the left is World War II. All right, tremendous, national effort that the government had to borrow a lot of money for. Well, we're up as a percentage of GDP, getting close to that anyway. Now, if you add on to that, the effects of the pandemic are not reflected here yet. Well, that's expected to get us up to 132% of GDP, significantly above the level of World War II by the end of 2021. All right. You note in World War II, we moved away from that debt level fairly quickly. The question now is, what's our plan for getting down from 132% of GDP as federal debt? Next slide. Now, looking at financial markets. Bad, but not unprecedented, right? This is the volatility index. So an index of how volatile the overall stock market is. And the levels were comparable to what we saw at the height of the financial crash in 2008 and have been coming down rapidly from that peak from a few weeks ago. Next slide. Dow Jones Industrial Average, also big declines, but not unprecedented. We saw similar magnitude declines in 2008, and there have been other episodes where we've seen, really large declines. Next slide. Now, on the other hand, the distribution is a little different to this. I put this together as just looking at the difference between the small firms and large firms. And, that's fairly stable over a number of years until it plunges with the pandemic. Small firms being hit much harder than large firms. Again, Main Street, Wall Street kind of difference. But if you look at these indexes of small firms, the magnitudes of those declines are much larger. Next slide. Now, looking at interest rates, same story, that we're seeing big declines in interest rates, but not unprecedented moves, right? This is showing the one-year Treasury rate going back to the 1960s. And see, after the financial crash, interest rates were near zero for a while. Federal Reserve then tried to move them up. Then the pandemic hits and they crash back down to where they were. Next slide. Next slide is showing 10-year rates, and even more clear that this is not an unprecedented decline, and in fact seems to be part of a long-term trend of a decline in long-term interest rates that goes back about 40 years. So again, big declines, significant declines in interest rates, but nothing absolutely unprecedented. Next slide. Now, another interesting thing is we have this massive government response, massive injection of liquidity, but we're not seeing signs of inflation. This chart is showing inflation expectations as measured from things like the Treasury inflation protected securities. And expected inflation, this is starting in January 1st of this year. Expected inflation then was about 1.8%, and it has fallen since then. We're now around 1.5% or so, and at one point, people were expecting inflation below 1%. And this is their expectation over the next 5 years. Now, in the short run, inflation will be even lower than that. The Cleveland Federal Reserve's current inflation estimate for the second quarter of 2020 is at an annualized rate of negative 3.8%. So we're likely to see consumer prices decline short term, but very low levels of inflation after that. Next slide. Gold prices, same story. We're seeing increases in gold prices, but we're not yet to the record levels that we saw after the crash of 2008. Gold prices often move, it's a little worrying though, gold prices often move up as an inflation hedge. If we're not expecting inflation, what are gold prices going up over? Perhaps they are worried about long-term inflation and disagree with other markets, but perhaps they're worried about other kinds of, more systemic problems in the economy, since gold tends to operate as an insurance policy against absolute catastrophe. Next slide. All right, so I mentioned some of the economic theories about this that we might be hearing more about. One is the sort of the Bernie Sanders approach, and I think we would have heard a lot more about this. Bernie Sanders came very close to getting the Democratic nomination. There was a while there when we thought he was inevitable. And the economists that he listens to and employs talk about something called modern monetary theory. And the idea is basically for the government to print money to fund government operations and to combat the inflation that might come along later, to raise taxes to pull that money back out of the economy. Now, I think that if Sanders were the nominee now, we might see different inflationary expectations in financial markets, but this is an important theory held by a number of influential people that we still might see more of. Now, the traditional approach to dealing with large government debts is austerity, to cut spending and raise taxes, right? Tighten our belts, live within our means, that sort of thing. Very difficult to achieve politically, and mixed evidence, mixed views of economists on whether that's actually the right approach or not. But I think both seem to, in the current political environment, both of these approaches appear to be unlikely. What's more likely, I think, is something called financial repression. So financial repression is a set of government actions, interventions in economies, regulations that try to force interest rates down below, or force interest rates down, and in particular down below the rate of inflation. It is a way of confiscating people's savings in order to keep government interest costs down. It also inflates away the principal value of the government debt and allows businesses to borrow at low rates. This was exactly the strategy that was used to deal with the large government debts after World War II, and will probably be, I think, the approach that we use going forward. So very interesting times, unpredictable. Past models that we've used just can't deal with changes like this that are so different from what we've seen in the past. But we can always try and speculate anyway. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for sharing all that. I always enjoy your presentations as data and chart heavy as they are. You always do such a great job of explaining that data, so thank you. Actually, quick question before I ask the question I've planned for the panel, going back to what Joe had talked about in the U curve, V curve, W curve. Just curious as to what your thoughts might be on that.
Well, very similar to Joe, that, the first thought was, well, certainly this will be a V situation. But I think that the tremendous damage that I mentioned that's being done to so many businesses will be harder to recover from than we thought at first. An economy, economists often talk in analogies, right? They think of sometimes the economy as like a car that we can turn off and restart again. Well, maybe a better analogy is like a living thing. We say, oh, hold your breath for an hour and then we'll get back, then get back to work. Well, it doesn't always work that way. So it may take longer than we had thought, had hoped.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Okay, well, what I want to do here is I'm going to stop the slide deck presentation here and then get everyone in gallery view. So I do want to pivot. I know we just shared a ton of really hard data to wrap your head around, but we wanted to do that just to share a somewhat of a picture of current state and kind of what we're working with in terms of the impact to the economy. And from here, I want to pivot to talking about, okay, this is our current state. We don't know what future state's going to look like. As we heard, kind of the common theme is uncertainty. But what are things that we can be doing now, as our state and other states, begin to reopen? What are some things that we can be doing to prepare for that, to be able to accelerate recovery? And so my question that I want each panelist to respond to, and then I'm going to look in the Q&A box here. So for participants that have questions, please be submitting them. But my question for the panel first here is, as the state starts allowing businesses to reopen, what is one thing you think we need to do to accelerate economic recovery? And whether that be specific to an industry you serve or on a macro level. And I'm just going to look kind of clockwise across my screen and then call on each person to respond to that. But starting with David, what's your one thing?
I would say clarity of the rules in the programs that that are designed to combat this economic situation, like PPP. You launch a program and you tell people, okay, we're going to give you a forgivable loan if you spend it on payroll. Okay, great. I'll spend it on payroll and I'll keep people on my payroll that I might have laid off otherwise. Then they say, oh, we're changing the rules. And now we think that these loans were given to businesses that we don't like so much. So we're going to change that. Well, wow, that's a bad situation, and it lowers people's confidence in these programs, reduces their willingness to participate in them, and we need to get that money out. So I'd say clarity of the rules, it would be a big help.
Yeah, we're hearing those frustrations from our business community as well. Joe, how about you? What's one thing?
Yeah, certainly agree on the clarity. I mean, we're seeing that all over the place, certainly. I think for me, as we think about economic recovery, I think just a general understanding that this is not going to be a light switch approach, getting back to David's point. This is like a slow dimmer, right? Turning up that dial, to use another analogy. And I just think we need to be patient. We need to be flexible. I think a lot of as we start to reopen, I think you'll see a lot of strict health mitigation strategies still being in place. And I think we just need to be aware of that and be graceful about that and really understand that it's going to take a significant amount of time to get back to, business as usual in our state. And so not necessarily a policy prescriptive, but I think we just have to have a general understanding that this is a very slow walk back to a new normal, so that we don't relapse into a worse economic crisis than we already found ourselves in. Because what we're doing right now is trying to prevent significant long-term decay and damage with all of these strategies, health strategies being in place. And if we ramp back up too quickly, the worst could happen.
Yes, thank you, Joe. I'm going to turn to my economic development peers here locally, and maybe starting with you, Josh. What's one thing?
I'll start by echoing your appreciation of David and Joe. I don't feel as though I belong anywhere on this panel when I hear those two talk. They're very good at what they do, and particularly David, you bring it down to the 5th grade level that I need in order to understand it in your presentation. So thanks. You know, I'll add another C to clarity, and that's really collaboration. You know, we've prided ourselves in this community for years on our ability to collaborate, whether it be through economic development or community development or events or volunteerism and things of that nature. And we've done a very good job and stood out as a community in the Iowa City area and in the successes that we've shared. As good as I believe we've done, I believe going forward, it almost has to be on steroids. You know, collaboration and really looking at the realignment of community, not so much city. You know, we're a bunch of cities, but we're really one community. And the town gown that little successes we've had over the years, that sort of collaboration amongst cities and the university and industry sectors, I believe is going to be key to how quickly we're able to recover realignment of opportunities and services, whether it be in transportation or public safety or economic and community development. I think those are all going to be the keys to how quickly we're able to accelerate recovery and be better together.
Thank you, Josh. Kate?
So I would say I agree with everything that's been said. In addition, I think we really need to celebrate and support creativity during this time. We have some companies right now being incredibly innovative. We've always had the spirit of innovation with the university here, and I think we need to double down on that during this time. We need to pay attention to the industries that are most vulnerable and assist them. We're doing a lot of listening right now to learn where some of those vulnerabilities are. We also have some industries here with med tech and educational technology that are truly the future. And so how do we really invest in those and support those creative opportunities and support our entrepreneurs who are going to be innovative in the years to come, and what kind of ecosystem can we continue to build to really be a place where those things can be celebrated and supported in a major way. So I think sometimes crises leads to needing to think outside the box in a lot of areas, and I think we'll see a lot of exciting things come from this. We just need to be the kind of place that really supports that and champions that creativity.
Great, thank you, Kate. Nancy?
Yeah, I'll unmute myself here. Yeah, I similarly am happy to be on this panel, and what I am really I'm humbled by is how many really amazing and great minds we have in this community. So to piggyback a little bit on Kate's comment about local innovation, and to really listen to the local heartbeat and authenticity of this place, to use that as a way to basically save Main Street. And I'll speak in particular from the lens of the Iowa City Downtown District, but across Iowa City, Coralville, North Liberty, there's some amazing independent retailers, both soft goods and restaurants, that really are the heartbeat of where people gather. And they are at the crux of the challenge today with how hard they've been impacted. And I think in order to recover from this, we need to come up with some really great and very quick short-term solutions to save those businesses, because what will happen is the complexity of our community will change. You know, we have larger businesses that will be able to hold on for the next year, and we'll have other businesses that want to enter this market. But the ones that are here, that are continuing to fight, they are local businesses. They're spending, all that money is coming in here. They're donating it to schools. They're supporting the larger ecosystem, and it's critical that they stay in place and that we can make it through. So the idea of our character and building it and using local innovation to work with those businesses to help them through this period, I think is the biggest thing for me.
Great, thank you. I just want to kind of echo and kind of key off of what my peers said here, and just let folks know, kind of go back to what Josh said around collaboration. We do have a group in place that's been meeting for a long time, and we call it the Economic Development Collaboration Group, and it's our 4 orgs plus the 3 city administrators, the county, there's a county supervisor representative, we've got the Community Foundation, United Way, the university, K-12 school district. This group has been in place for a while, and it really was to share information and to kind of, an attempt to also reduce any duplication or conflicts and whatnot. And the group has recently started talking about, just that, how can we collaborate more? And as you've heard, not just from my peers, but also David and Joe, in terms of like, how do we even look beyond just simply recovering, but how can we be even stronger coming out of this, and even more resilient, and even better, better together. So I think that, that's going to be part of this effort as well. So I'm going to look here to see if we've got any questions here. So we do have one in here so far, and it's around kind of a certain kind of segment that we haven't talked about or addressed yet. But the question is around, what point do you think business landlords will reduce rent to keep tenants, and what indicators will they look at to begin this conversation? What indicators can tenants use to ask for a reduction that will speak to the landlords? And I know that that's such a tricky balance, because I know landlords trying to do their best to support their tenants, but also are feeling the pinch, and how do we navigate that? And I think maybe a couple of you could speak to this too. And I don't want to call you out, David, as a local business owner, apartment owner, but
so yeah, I'm also a commercial landlord, and also a commercial tenant. There's a lot of negotiation going on now between tenants and landlords, and we've had, and for the most part, the ones I've been involved in have gone very smoothly. And the fact that banks were deferring mortgage payments has helped a lot of landlords to defer rent payments. I've seen a lot of deferral of rent payments. I have not seen rent reductions yet. So I think the question was about rent reductions. And my personal view is that is coming. I think that we will probably see some businesses fail, and that will mean that there will be some vacant commercial space. That will give tenants options. And when they can play one option off another, they will probably be able to negotiate rent decreases. But for now, we're mostly seeing those deferrals, and usually, deferrals either added to the end of the lease or paid back over, calendar year 21 or something like that.
Thank you, David, for putting your landlord hat on there. I'm going to respond to that. One of the other questions, that we just talked about, the one thing we need to do is really start, preparing for recovery. What are some of the challenges that we might anticipate, we'll need to navigate in this reopening and recovery period? I mean, David, you kind of mentioned one of them in terms of the rules changing, and some of the maybe disincentive that the CARES Act may have provided with the additional unemployment benefit, and we're hearing from businesses that workforce may not want to return because they're getting paid more on unemployment, and so what are some of the challenges, like things like that we should prepare for, that we might need to navigate?
Is that me or for Joe?
I throw that out kind of to the group. Whoever wants to take a stab at it first.
Joe, you want to start?
Sure. I'll start. So I think one of the things that we really need to be conscious of and aware of as Iowans and as business leaders in this economic development space is our overall workforce situation, right? I mean, 7 weeks ago, Iowa in particular had a unique workforce challenge. We had about 60,000 job postings available. So companies in Iowa looking for about 60,000 people to do very specific and often very high technical, very, very complicated jobs. and we only had about 45,000 people that were actively seeking employment. What's happened now over the last 7 weeks is the complete inverse of that, right? And so we have to understand what our workforce will look like, both in terms of what the overall numbers on rehiring might look like from our different companies and businesses across the state, but then also what are those needs that individuals can fill for companies. You know, we hope that companies will hire back very, very quickly. But I think only time will tell. And so what does that overall workforce picture look like, I think will be absolutely critical. And unfortunately, we just don't really know what that is right now. I think one thing's for certain. I think you know, we can always rely on good Iowa work ethic and people trying to get back to work as quickly as possible. It's just a matter of what that overall job market or labor market looks like for that possibility.
And this is similar to what I was saying earlier, but a big challenge, I think, is that, all right, so putting it in economics, there's a basic formula, you know, MV equals PQ. Money supply times money velocity equals PQ, which is GDP. All right, we want to keep GDP up. Monetary velocity has plummeted. All right, one way I think of that is that I don't even put my wallet in my pocket anymore in the morning because I know I'm not going to be spending any money. So money velocity has gone way down. The way to compensate for that is to boost the money supply. We need lots of money injected into the economy. All right, Milton Friedman, famous economist, used to talk about that as a helicopter drop of money is what you need in a situation like this. Well, all right, so we need to get that money out. The problem is that, you know, clever people are going to grab that money fastest. Doesn't necessarily matter from a macro point of view because, you know, we just need the money out. But it's always going to look unfair when you do a program like that. So we do this program to try and rescue the economy, or various programs, and it's going to look unfair. People are going to be upset, and that's going to reduce the incentive to have these programs in the first place. You know, another point on the rents that we were talking about before, I saw this morning that I think it's Prudential Insurance that is thinking about moving its workforce to home-based work permanently. It's working so well for them that they are thinking, all right, we're just going to keep doing this going forward. Well, that's going to, if that's a trend, that will reduce demand for office space and commercial real estate tremendously. And that will certainly open up options for small businesses to try and take over some of those spaces for you know, much lower rents.
And maybe just to tap onto that rent issue real fast, and sorry, Kate, I think that's exactly right. And as you look at some of the financial institutions in particular, our members at the Iowa Business Council, I don't want to say have been surprised or that they didn't see this coming, but I think some of them have been surprised about how quickly their workforce has adapted to working from home and telecommuting, and in addition to that, how productive they've been working from home. And so to David's point on retail space, we were just on a call this morning with some of our members, and some of our members have prime office location in lower Manhattan with significant long-term leases and significant overhead in that. And they've been shut down for 7 weeks in New York City. So what does that look like for them moving forward? I think that's a really interesting question. I say this sort of tongue in cheek. There are also others in the workforce working from home that are very excited to come back to work because they've got distractions and other things like that at their home. But I think that will be a really interesting point to see how the overall landscape or overhead with respect to office space works.
I follow up on that question, and what kind of lag time do you see between vacancy and refilling those properties? Is it years and years, or can this happen relatively quickly?
Some of it depends on lease terms, right? So if there's a financially strong tenant who has a long-term lease, hey, they may not just be able to to break it, and things might not happen quickly. But in many cases, if a tenant goes bankrupt and simply can't pay the rent, that space will be available. and others that have short-term leases or negotiating a lease termination, I think that there's a good chance that a lot of space will be available in the near future.
I was just going to add one thing to that, Kim. I think Joe's right with the remote working just exploding now in industries that you never would think it would be possible. Many of our manufacturing facilities have people doing remote working that were always exempt from the ability to do that. So it's hard, as they say, to come back from that when you've told them for years they can't work from home, when suddenly you realize they can. So just how that's going to change the dynamic, I think, in our employers' facilities, but also an opportunity, I think, with remote working, nationwide, people will really be able to live anywhere they want for a lot of companies. And so that requirement to live where you work, we really accelerated that ability to be more mobile. And with the pandemic and second waves, there may be more movement of people that want to leave larger, more concentrated areas. So I think from a population standpoint, we may see some shifting, and we need to be ready to be, and I believe we are, but make sure that we're really thinking about those community development pieces, because as people look for those opportunities to live somewhere with good health care, with strong schools, all of those things become even more important, I think.
Yeah. And that in our area, of course, that leads into the question of universities and whether, online learning, what impact that will have. And, it's a little early to say. A lot of these online courses were put together very quickly. So we'll see how well it does and how much students, demand the in-person experience.
And I'm glad you segued to that, David, because there's one question in the Q&A box here, which I think is like the $1 million, $1 billion question, and that's, will classes at the university be held as scheduled this fall?
Well, President Richards, President of the Board of Regents, has said that our plan is to open in the fall, open fully. Of course, unexpected events might force us to revisit that, but our hope and goal is to open in the fall.
Yeah, and that's such a critical part of our local economy, and I feel like everyone's kind of holding their breaths, waiting.
Yes.
So
yes.
That's good to hear. I do want to, as we're coming up on time here, I do want to end with kind of one final positive question. And some of you have mentioned some, positive things throughout the webinar here in terms of opportunities, being creative, innovating. But what might be some of the, if there are any, bright spots, positive impacts to the economy that come out of this pandemic? And whoever wants to start first on that.
Yeah, I'll go quickly. I think from my perspective and what we're seeing, and sort of to wrap up a lot of the different conversation, I think there's a tremendous opportunity for some significant investments within infrastructure, not only nationally, but particularly here in the state. But more specific than just infrastructure in particular is broadband infrastructure. We're literally on a Zoom panel discussion right now. We just had a quick conversation on telecommuting and what the future of work looks like. We have taken really good steps over the last few years from a state legislative policy perspective to invest in broadband and invest in broadband capacity throughout the entire state. I think there needs to be a lot more of that. The governor would be the first person to say that that's true, and this is certainly a bipartisan issue. It's incredibly expensive, in some cases to hundreds of millions of dollars. But I think if we've learned anything from this, it's how vital that is to your everyday work capacity. It's just as vital as indoor plumbing and electricity in your home already. And so I think it presents us a great opportunity to really focus in on that and hopefully have some measures put forward.
Your sound got a little garbled there, Joe, at the end.
Sorry Sorry, they were very good points, I will assure you.
I know you were speaking of broadband.
Exactly.
Right. That's a great way to illustrate the importance of broadband. I think you did that on purpose. Yeah. That's a great point. I'm on the governor's Empower Rural Iowa task force, and rural connectivity is an important part of what we're trying to achieve. That's an excellent point, and it certainly does, demonstrate the need for that investment. And I suppose that there are several other things like that, I'm sure, but I think it's important to keep in mind that this is a catastrophic economic event that's destroying businesses, destroying futures, and destroying people's careers. And of course, we need to be safe and prudent, but we need to find ways to get the economy moving again. And it's certainly not it's great to look for bright sides, but important to keep in mind just what a terrible event this is economically. Sorry to be so down there.
Follow that up. I think you pushed Josh somewhere along the way there.
I was just going to say, I think one bright side is we've really seen examples of people taking care of one another. As much as we're unconnected, there are ways we are more connected than ever now when it comes to needs and some of the local things that have happened around supporting businesses and championing each other's philanthropy and people that are just stepping up in big ways. And so I think in some ways, it's really showing the human side of our communities, and we can do more when we work together. And so if we can build off of that and continue to take care of each other, like David said, this is a long time from being over. And so we're going to have to continue that mentality of who's vulnerable, what do we need to do to make sure that we're taking care of everyone along the way so that we're stronger as an overall community at the end.
And I would just quickly say that it's such a shock to the system, the state that we're in right now. I think everyone is overthinking and rethinking everything. And I think that there's lots of silver linings in that, because the way our society was before was not perfect. And now's an opportunity to think about, number one, what's really most important. Food security is critical. And I think I'm proud of this community for really working around that issue and doing what we can to address that first, because it's so important. And then second, what can we do to improve? And I think that we're on the track for that. We just have to start, motivating and collaborating and really getting organized quickly if we're going to stay on top of the curve here.
Well, thank you, Nancy. I think that's a good kind of final note to end on here. And I just want to, thank everyone, on the panel for engaging in this first conversation of, I hope, many, around recovery. I really appreciated both the realism and the optimism and kind of, taking a hard look at the data and just thinking ahead as to what we need to do. So thank you all for being on this panel, and thank you to those of you in the audience who have joined us and listened to this, today and week in and week out. Again, join us next Wednesday as we talk more about ag and food, and Josh is going to be leading that one, and that's going to be a great webinar as well. And again, this Friday with our local public health officials talking about guidelines for reopening. So again, thank you everyone for being here. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.